Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Ilona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this live episode of the Prospect podcast, which we're recording as a special US election bonus. I'm Ilona Ferber, Senior Editor at Prospect.
And I'm Ellen Halliday, Prospect's Deputy Editor.
It's brilliant to see that so many of you have logged in to join us, and hopefully many more will be tuning in when this episode goes out on Saturday, just ahead of the all-important election in the states that we're all so obsessed with at the moment.
This is a really fun episode because I'm delighted to be able to introduce our guest. Our guest is Jill Abramson. Jill was the executive editor of the New York Times from 2011 to 2014 and spent some 17 years in senior positions at the New York Times, including as Washington bureau chief and as managing editor. So she's covered a lot of US elections in that time, and we're so lucky that she's been covering this election for Prospect. She's written a bunch of columns for us that Iman will be able to share in the chat over the course of this session. Jill, it's lovely to see you. Thank you.
Lovely to be here.
Lots of you have submitted questions in advance. Thank you so much for doing that. They are excellent questions.
We will be bringing in some of your questions and putting them to Jill over the course of the next sort of half hour-ish. But to give you a chance to get thinking, Ilona and I thought we would kick off the conversation with a few questions ourselves.
So yes, please do send your questions through to Jill as we go, and we'll get to the Q&A section in just about 15 minutes or so. But first of all, Jill, some questions for you from me and Ellen. You're in Boston, Massachusetts, which, as far as we understand American politics, is a pretty safe Democrat state. What's the mood like where you are? Are people tense? Are they nervous? What's it like?
People are an absolute wreck. They're so nervous. No one can concentrate on anything but talk. Who do you think is going to win? Who do you think is going to win? It's just everywhere. And, people I know, and including me, I'm certainly getting no work done, really, other than reading the news and trying to keep up with everything and watch the rallies that Trump and Harris are having today out west, and wishing that it was Tuesday already.
Do you when Harris took over from Biden, there was so much excitement among Democrats. People were using the word joy a lot at the time. They were talking about the joy of Harris campaigning and as a candidate. It doesn't feel like that at all now. That sense of joy is sort of dissipated.
Well, I watched her closing rally that she had in Washington, and there were 75,000 joyous people there. So there was still joy. She must be absolutely exhausted. Doing these fly rounds is very punishing, and they'll be going until way into next Tuesday for sure. And, she has to be as nervous as all of us are, and on tenterhooks. Imagine how it must be to be Kamala Harris, looking every day at these polls that are so close. All of the 7 battleground states are within the margin of error. Most of them are separated by less than 1 point. It couldn't be closer in terms of the Electoral College. You were asking me about being in Boston. I'm in the most reliably blue state there is. And there was a saying once after the 1988 election in which the Democratic candidate only won 1 vote, which was his home state of Massachusetts. There were bumper stickers that said, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts."
Who was the candidate that year, Jill?
Michael Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts.
So, Jill, I mean, the nerves this election seem higher than usual. It's it's being talked about as being unusually tight as well as kind of an unusually consequential election. But you've covered a lot of elections, so I mean, tell us how does this really compare? Does it feel more unique in this moment, or when you reflect on past elections, where does this one sit?
This one feels unique because it's the third election with Donald Trump, who is unique. There's never been a candidate like him who says the things he says, who believes in presidential power being unfettered, who would really, if he is elected, be beyond authoritarian. You very well know that, people who had top positions in his administration have called him a fascist. There's just never been a candidate like him. For another reason he's so unique is, he'd never run for political office before he won in 2016. He'd been a real estate mogul and, not exactly, at the tip top of that profession. Whether how many billions he actually has been the subject of a lot of arguing and controversy. And he was mainly known by Americans as the star of The Apprentice. So that was his appeal. He wasn't a politician. He was completely outside of the system. And to be now on our third national election where he is the Republican nominee is just like nothing else.
The election is now days away, and there's millions of ballots have already been mailed. We know this is a tight race.
I voted.
Ah, good to hear that there's one good mark in the box there from you. We know that it's a tight race, even with all those early voters as well. It's a tight race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. For listeners who are not from the US and don't understand sort of the very complicated American political system, what does a tight race mean in the US context? You mentioned the battleground states a little bit before, but where is the race particularly tight? How would you explain it to an outsider?
Well, it is complicated because you would think that the candidate who gets the most votes is the winner. But I know your very smart audience is well aware that as recently as 2016, that Hillary Clinton got millions of more votes than Donald Trump, but she lost in the electoral vote category. And the Electoral College decides who is president. You need to get to 270 electoral votes to be elected. And so each state has a different number of electoral votes. For instance, Pennsylvania, one of the battleground states and perhaps the most important one, has 19 electoral votes. And it's so important because that's a lot of electoral votes. And the way that the polls have been going is that there are 7 so-called battleground states, which are very likely to decide the election because of the number of electoral votes they have collectively. And it's a combination of 3 states that are called the blue wall because they've tended to go more Democratic than not, although Trump has carried them all. And they are Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
And polling has been close the entire time, like since Harris took over as candidate.
They have been close, very close, not quite as close as they are right now. They're on a knife's edge right now. But at periods where you'd think, that Harris might have moved significantly out front, like after both the Democratic convention and then her one debate with Donald Trump. She didn't really move in a sizable way, so they have been close throughout. Uh, I should note Harris is certainly doing better than Joe Biden was. He was trailing by a significant margin.
Yeah. One of the pieces that you've written for us in recent months was about kind of which groups both candidates having to go after in these last weeks, the kind of undecided voters. I mean, what could happen and what are you looking for in these last days to see whether the dial can move and to try and think about where these groups you talked about, Hispanic voters and Black voters in particular, where they're going to fall?
The thing that I'm watching now as we head to Election Day is turnout. The winner will be the candidate who succeeds in turning out their supporters in the biggest numbers. And that's just the way it's going to go. And we don't know whether it's going to be Trump's base. He has, as all of your readers and listeners know, a fervent, devoted base, which almost follows him with a religious zeal. But that's not enough to win. He has to turn out voters who've been undecided. It seems unbelievable to me that there are still undecided voters, but there are both undecided voters and limited information voters who just still don't know very much about even Trump, let alone not knowing much about Harris. And whether they vote or not, nobody knows. But, they have to hope that they turn out ones that are at least leaning towards either Trump. Trump wants to turn out, obviously, undecideds who are leaning towards him, and the reverse for Harris.
What do we know about, like, kind of on the day, what each party will do to get people out? Does one have a more effective kind of operation on election day than others, or what do we know?
Well, Trump historically has not had that strong a get out the vote operation, but Republican sources of mine are saying it's better and more organized this time. So I don't know. The Democrats are typically advantaged by things like support of labor unions, which are very adept at getting their members out to vote. I wrote a bit about slippage for the Democrats among Black voters, like a key constituency, but the network of Black churches has historically been an important vehicle to turn out Black Democratic voters. And now everything is targeted and done digitally. In some ways, the old-fashioned methods like phone banks and knocking on doors has been superseded by digital communication to get people to the polls. And of course, Election Day has somewhat been diminished in importance because of early voting and absentee voting.
How much do we know from the early voting already?
We know how many early votes there have been in the states. And from what I've read, usually, again, Democrats have enjoyed an advantage in early voting, but a lot of Republicans have voted early this time.
Bill, this has been called by some people sort of the gender gap election because men prefer Trump and women prefer Kamala Harris. And Trump, to try to appeal to women, gave this kind of very strange speech where he said, "I will be your protector. I will protect you." Is he managing to appeal to women in any way? Is he managing to break through that at all? And Kamala Harris has done some things to try to appeal to men as well, right? They've both kind of tried to break that barrier.
Yeah, I mean, it's been described as the boys versus the girls election. I think that's a bit simplistic, but The gender gap has become a gender chasm, quite literally. Harris enjoys, I think it's now up to 58% of women support her. Majority support of men support Donald Trump. He's doing especially well with non-college educated younger white males. And that's why, you've seen both at the convention and at his rallies a lot of this kind of macho, I find it offensive, stupid, bro humor.
Nikki Haley said yesterday, I think, after the Madison Square Garden rally, she made a comment that it was possibly going to be uncomfortable for women, this sort of bro humor, macho stuff.
Well, it's hard for me to imagine that it isn't the fact that two dozen women at least have accused Donald Trump of sexual misconduct, that doesn't make it hard for women to support him, let alone that he appointed the 3 justices of the Supreme Court who made the difference in overturning Roe v. Wade and taking away women's right to an abortion. And that's been Harris's, I think, most effective issue, abortion. She is very eloquent when she's talking about it. Michelle Obama has been out at rallies talking about the outrage of women losing control over their own bodies. And it's a big motivator. If there's a big turnout of of women, especially independent women in the suburbs, who I think will go for Harris, it might be a very good day for her.
Yeah, it's definitely a powerful constituency, and Donald Trump has made his position on the key issues that affect women, abundantly clear. So that will be fascinating to watch. I wonder if we should maybe go to some of the questions that we've had submitted from the audience. So Jill, I mean, this is a question that in a way is from all of us, but also is the question that's come from Graham Main. Simply, he wants to know who you think is going to win.
Yeah, well, that's the question I would be a fool to answer. And, I just would be. I'm not going to say. It seems like, the mood of the prognosticators who I listened to this morning was feeling, Trump had moved up, I think, a point in Pennsylvania, but that's meaningless. So I honestly, I have a feeling in my heart, but not in my gut.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair enough. And I think you're right that at this point, it does seem very close to call. I mean, just a related sort of, I guess, follow-up question, because it's the reason we can't call it is because the polls look so tight. But to what
They
extent
could be wrong, too.
Well, this is the
We should say
question.
that right away.
Jill, we were just talking about how impossible it is to call the result of this election. And a question that we had submitted from one of our audience members, Adam Bethlehem, was about whether we have any reason to actually trust the polls. How good are they?
Well, there's some reason to trust them, but they have been wrong in the past. I talked about 2016 a bit earlier, and that night began with the polls overwhelmingly showing that Hillary Clinton was going to win that election. So they were wrong then. And, people can answer dishonestly. I mean, there are supposedly in both camps kind of secret supporters, maybe women who are registered Republicans who are going to vote for Harris but don't want anyone, including a pollster, to know. And the same thing for, people may feel embarrassed that they're voting for Donald Trump. So And it's possible that they're just off. They have been off in the past. And in my opinion, as an editor, there's way too much so-called horse race coverage of polls.
I guess it's how people keep themselves kind of, and
Right. It's like a betting parlor.
exactly. While they're waiting, the kind of the nervousness you explained at the beginning, this is a way of kind of keeping going until the result comes in. Related to the point you just made about women voters, we have a question from Jane West, and she asks, will the abortion ballot measures affect the election turnout, do you think?
Yes. And in every election where abortion has been on the ballot so far, the pro-choice side has won. So
one other question here that's been submitted about one of the perhaps more controversial and unexpected figures who's loomed large in this election, by Elon Musk. So we were talking about how difficult it is for both parties to kind of get people out to vote. And this question from Timothy Mail is, how can the actions of Elon Musk paying for election registrations be within election rules? And why are the Democrats not jumping up and down protesting about this? Compare and contrast to Trump jumping on the UK Labour Party when this appears to have happened in any number of past elections. So what did you make of that Elon Musk move?
I thought it's reprehensible and ridiculous almost. And Democrats are jumping up and down about the role Elon Musk is playing in this election. He, launched his own super PAC. He's spending hundreds of millions of dollars. The amount of money in this election is just, that's another thing that makes this election unique. I should have mentioned it earlier because money in politics was my beat for a long time as a political reporter. But, the Musk, Timothy Mellon, a member of the Mellon family, is Trump's biggest donor with billions. It's crazy. And, Kamala Harris has raised over $1 billion, mainly in smaller amounts of money for more people, which is at least more healthy for democracy. But this is the biggest money election by far that we've ever seen. And then you factor in the Senate control of the Senate is up for grabs as well. And some of those Senate races have cost, multi-millions of dollars.
From a quick question, actually, from us before we go back to questions that were submitted from the audience. Just while we're on a billionaire, let's talk about another one. One of the big stories of this week has been the fact that the Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, has been hemorrhaging subscribers since the newspaper decided not to endorse any candidate in this most consequential of American elections. You wrote about this for the Boston Globe as well. How significant is this story for kind of American democracy? Will it make a difference to how people vote? What is really at stake there with that story?
Well, what's at stake there, I think, is more the honor of a great newspaper, the Washington Post. I don't actually think newspaper endorsements make that much difference in how people vote. But they have a symbolic and almost a moral importance because it's a news institution saying who they think is most worthy of leading the country. And usually newspaper endorsements are full of useful information about the records of the candidates and whatnot. And that's why we have a First Amendment, is to provide critical information that people can make important decisions on. And what's more important than casting a vote for president? So what was so unusual and I think reprehensible in the case of Jeff Bezos yanking and killing what had been a prepared endorsement of Kamala Harris by the Washington Post is he did it 11 days before the election. It's fine. If the Washington Post had decided they didn't want to endorse a candidate, then announce it months earlier. Don't wait until you have to sandbag your own editorial staff and kill an editorial endorsement that's been written. And that's what stoked all this anger.
What do you think it says about the health of the US media as we go into, what's likely to be a next administration, no matter who wins when
Well, we may not
the
know
scrutiny
who
will be
wins
important.
right away.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, has this kind of undermined the health of US media, the trust that people can have in it?
I think, what it does is it makes the billionaire class look like they're scared of Donald Trump and ruffling his feathers. And that, is not healthy for democracy, or it's pathetic. All of these, Bezos, has a space company, and Amazon, has a huge data business, cloud business, and all of them have money, government contracts at stake, or broadcasting licenses that they're scared will be canceled, and so they don't want to endorse Kamala Harris and make Donald Trump an enemy, because if there's one thing we know, if he's elected, it will be, retribution will be a word that we read over and over again. He's vowed retribution.
We have a question here from Christopher Boston. He says, with such small differences between the Democrats and Republicans on policy, why is Trump at the same time divisive and popular? Are there such small differences between them on policy? Is that right? Would you agree with that statement?
No, I wouldn't. I think, just look at taxes, for instance. Donald Trump and the Republican platform want to give the wealthiest Americans another big tax cut. Kamala Harris wants to raise the taxes on corporations. That's a significant difference. Kamala Harris believes in environmental regulation and oversight by the EPA. Donald Trump and the Republicans want to get rid of environmental regulation. Donald Trump has vowed to get rid of the Department of Education. Kamala Harris, portrays herself as a big supporter of public education. I could go on and on.
One of the kind of big themes and the questions that we've been asked like quite a lot of times as ahead of this podcast is about the future of democracy. You've talked about the risk that a Trump victory you think poses to democracy. So, I mean, do you think American democracy fundamentally could survive a Trump election? Or is this kind of another almost like pre-Civil War moment in which, America is going to be in a very real conflict with itself?
Well, being in a real conflict within itself is different from being pre-Civil War. An eternal optimist and a great believer in democracy. So, I have to believe we survive 4 years of him before. I know that this administration, if it happens, will be worse and more dangerous. So I have definite fears about it. But I think the American system's strong and will survive. There are a million things that I'm worried about. I'm worried about if the election is so close that we don't know who the winner is again, for days. The Republicans are, Trump's most ardent supporters and right-wing podcasters like Joe Rogan and Ben Shapiro are already saying that that the Democrats have rigged the election again. So that is undermining to democracy.
If Trump were to win the election, do you think we'll see a similar, do you think the Democrats will kind of, lose graciously, or will there also be a bit of pushback from the other side?
Well, if they have evidence of any kind of voting fraud, they'll push back. But the thing that distinguished Donald Trump in 2020 were all of those lawsuits he brought charging voter fraud, and there was none. And he's been talking about undocumented immigrants voting illegally, and that hasn't happened. So no, the Democrats will not do that.
Donald Trump has basically taken over the Republican Party. Do you think there's any chance the party will change? Or is it kind of gone too far on the MAGA route?
I think it's gone too far in the MAGA route. It's in the palm of Donald Trump's hands. And I don't know after this election, if Trump loses, what will happen to it. I don't see, everybody turning to Nikki Haley or someone more moderate. I really, that will be one of the if not the biggest story coming out of this.
One question we had from a listener related to that is kind of about the consequences of this change in the Republican Party. So if the Republican Party is now in the grip of MAGA, a fundamentally kind of a group that's geared towards autocracy, that's undermining the institutions of democracy, that leaves America kind of as a one-party state. There's only one party left that is itself a democratic force. That's a really difficult position. Isn't that a bit of a bind for America?
It's a tragedy for America. The two-party system, has been one of the hallmarks of making, the government work. And it's a terrible plight for the country, definitely. The Democratic Party now is, the shining light of the core principles of the country, of fairness and equal justice and the rule of law and all of the things that this country has always held dear, and I believe still does.
Really, a good follow-up to that is a question from a listener called Peter Norris, who asks, what has changed in Georgia for voters to return to the Republicans?
Well, Georgia has swung back and forth and is part of the solid South. And what happened after the Civil Rights Act was passed back in the 60s is that the southern states went from being Democratic to being Republican. Georgia, what's different in Georgia this year from 2020 is, unfortunately, Raphael Warnock is not on the ballot this time. And he brought out, because there was a special Senate, he was running for a special Senate seat. And he brought out a very large Black Democratic turnout of his supporters. And even with that, Biden won Georgia very narrowly. So it isn't, Georgia is definitely a hard-fought state, but it's not that surprising to have it be Donald Trump is up in Georgia.
Of course, the last election, Georgia was also the site of kind of post-election contestation in which Donald Trump, tried to find votes for
his famous phone call to the Secretary of State. Yes,
exactly. Have you heard much about preparedness for similar events happening this time? Is there work being done to kind of protect the election officials who are counting votes and make sure that the whole process is fair?
Yes, there have been many articles about that this week. There are efforts to protect them from being intimidated and to protect the votes as well.
Yeah. How risky do you think it is that something similar would happen again?
Oh, I hate to even think about it. There's a risk in everything, but I think this time the Democratic Party is much more prepared for ill doing than it was 4 years ago. They have many, many lawyers stationed in all of the important contested state.
We have a few minutes left. So if anybody wants to put through any questions for Jill, please do. But we have here an interesting question from Jeff Purser. He's asking, given the race is so close, what do you think either side can do to make a difference to the result? Is it about just getting out the vote? Is that what's left, basically, just getting people out to vote? Or is there something else? Is there some sort of messaging that they need to focus on? What's going to decide it for either of them, do you think?
Well, I do think getting out the vote is the most important thing at the end. But, I look at that outrageous rally at Madison Square Garden that Donald Trump had, where people were saying, overtly misogynist and racist things. If there's more of that, maybe that could make a difference too. It's, it's unpredictable what comes out of Donald Trump's mouth and the mouths of his supporters. I would hope that would influence people with decency.
Since the Madison Square Garden rally, have you sensed that it has made a difference? Some of those kind of the very offensive comment about Puerto Rico, anti-Semitic, racist, misogynistic comments. Have you sensed that there's a bit of a change among Republicans about that, or not really?
I haven't really. There's certainly been a lot of attention to it in the media, but no.
So, Jill, as we're kind of coming up to the last days before the election, it's super close. What are the stories that you'll be looking for and the questions that you'll be trying to answer in the days kind of immediately after the election? And where should our listeners be looking as well?
I'll be asking if Kamala Harris loses, which I very much hope she does not, whether she had a strong enough message on the economy. If Trump loses, my major question is, does that mean that MAGA will lose its scale 4?
That's a really fascinating question. You mentioned also kind of the lawyers that the Democrats have, across the country. Are there going to be legal challenges no matter the result that we should be looking at?
There'll be legal challenges on the Democratic side only if there's evidence of chicanery or fraud, and whether there will be or not, I don't know. I suspect the Republicans will, if the vote is as close as the polls are showing, that, of course, they'll try every trick in the book.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that probably is time for us to wrap up this session. So I would say thank you so much to everybody who's joined. Jill, thank you so much for joining.
Oh, thank you both so much. Great questions from the audience that I really appreciated. They had me thinking.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're crossing our fingers for you all over here.
Yeah. And so that's just about everything for this evening. Just to say as well, the latest issue of Prospect was launched this week. We've got some brilliant essays on the United States in there, including from Francis Fukuyama and from the constitutional legal expert Alison Lacroix. There's also an investigation about temporary accommodation and a really fascinating feature by the writer Sarah Manavis about the women who are somehow persuaded by the misogyny of people such as Andrew Tate, which may be an interesting read for some of us on this call. It's really something else. Thank you so much for joining. That's all. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to see you next time we do one of these live events.